Hi, I'm Susan King. Welcome to On Second Thought, and the good guy next to me in the white hat would be Mr. William Wagener.
Welcome to On Second Thought. Have you lost control of your government? Of course you have. You knew I was going to say that. If you've been watching me for a year, and I've been here for more than a year, you know that I always bring up these nasty little issues the government doesn't want you to notice, that they're taking power away from the people and giving it to the dictators. I mean our president and governors who run your life. Did I do a slip?
I think it was intentional, but
it was intentional. Yeah. But hey, it's not far from the truth. When you got the things happening that are happening in America today, you just might need some marijuana. Did I say that?
True.
Okay. If you're under 14 years of age, you probably shouldn't be watching this. This show is going to do a replay of a well-done panel discussion between a medical doctor, a lawyer, and some marijuana users. This was done by Robert Backus, who is the host of that show called The Libertarian Alternative. It was done in July of 2000. If you're under 16, or if you haven't grown up, you're 60 and you haven't grown up yet, you don't want to watch this. You need to change the channel now. But if you're interested in this whole subject and the fact that this state of California has decriminalized medical marijuana and yet police are still wrongfully arresting people under federal laws, you might be interested in this. Just for the record, I, William Wagener, do not use marijuana, and to my knowledge, no. I've never noticed Susan King to be using it. However, as a libertarian, I believe you have the right to use and put into your body whatever you choose to do so.
Provided it doesn't harm anyone else.
Provided, exactly.
In my opinion.
No, that's a libertarian opinion. You can do what you want as long as you don't hurt somebody else. That's the point. And people drink beer all the time legally, but they don't get arrested till they start punching people out and driving drunk and killing people or hurting people. Same thing should apply for marijuana. You should be able to use it in the privacy of your home as long as you don't go out and hurt other people. Just like beer or whiskey or cell phones for that matter.
Cell phones.
Yeah, I've seen some crazy women drivers with cell phones.
Anyway, drivers. Oh,
getting
boy,
back to this.
I'm not even going to touch that.
Oh, I'm sorry, Susan. I wasn't talking about you.
Oh, I know. I know.
You're a good driver, unlike me. Anyway, this is William Wagener and Susan King saying, please watch this. It's a really well-done production. You will see the host identified as Robert Backus from his Santa Barbara show called The Libertarian Alternative. And here we go.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. What you see on your screen is a fantastic graphic. I just wish you could see it in motion, flapping in the breeze. It is the flag of the Cannabis Party of Canada, a newly formed party that has, I think, about 51 candidates in Canada in this November election. You see, in Canada, they have legalized hemp, and the growing of hemp by the acre is a massive, massive market up there. Hemp is a wonderful fiber. And the people are afraid of losing that freedom, so they formed a political party up there to take care of the problem. And I think that we, down here in the lower 40, 50 something now states, ought to do the same. We ought to have a political party centered on the issue of hemp, marijuana, and most, I think specifically, tolerance. In an age of zero tolerance, we need a party of tolerance. We need to legalize vice. Vice is the private, individual behavior of an individual that does not violate anyone's rights, but is scorned by the powers that be. And anybody should be free to do in their private lives, in their own homes, whatever they choose to do, whether it's called vice or virtue. I personally would not pray to supernatural demons of air and fire and would consider it a vice to do so, but I would grant every Christian on earth the right to that vice in the privacy of their own homes, as long as they don't do it publicly, you know, in front of a lot of innocently impressionable children at football games or something else. But vice, what you do at home, in your own home, in the privacy of your own home, violating nobody's rights, is something that should not be of any concern to Big Brother, and we should all have a party championing the legalization of vice. So that's my mega theme for the evening, but we're going to speak on a little bit smaller, narrower subject tonight. So in a moment, I'll be introducing to you our guest after these words of information from the Libertarian Party. I hope we can cut to commercial here on this non-commercial station. On the set here tonight with me, we have approximately, I would say 4 of the bravest men in Santa Barbara. They are personally involved and dedicated to bucking the system. And when I say bucking the system, I mean that bureaucratic despotism, that dictatorship out there run by our city manager that just squeezes in every little way to make our rubber stamp city council helpless and useless. And therefore, when we get some new freedoms or some new recognition of our rights, it's a real tough fight. And as you may know, medical marijuana, or the tolerance of medical marijuana in Santa Barbara, is a fight currently being brought to the city council. And just recently we had a very small victory by a very small vote to let the city of Santa Barbara come to the assistance of the medically afflicted who need marijuana for one reason or another in their medical problems. The city council voted by 1 vote to even let this thought be considered by the ordinance committee. I mean, this wasn't a vote on whether to have a defensive ordinance on behalf of these victims. It was simply, do we want to talk about it? And city council was barely able to say, yeah, let's talk about it. Let's see what Hawaii is doing. Let's see what Oregon is doing. Let's see what other states and cities and counties are doing. And so we'll let our ordinance committee chew on this. Well, believe me, in this city, that's progress. So let's show our guest here and make some introductions. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me on the set this evening. To my right is David Pryor, a gentleman who has actually gone through the arduous process of validating his right to medical marijuana through the court system. And he actually has the support of the courts to treat his ailments and illnesses with the marijuana plant that he grows, if I'm correct.
That's correct.
Don't want to set you up for a fall there.
No, that's correct.
Okay, and to his right is a medical doctor by the name of Dr. David Behrman, who is well spoken on the subject of the medicinal value of marijuana as such. He travels the state speaking. He is an open advocate of the legalization, and we're going to hear a lot of medical expertise from him. To his right is a gentleman by the name of Seymour Weisberg. Seymour is a lawyer, a retired public defender, I believe.
That's right.
And he is expert on these critically confusing, difficult legal questions. So we're going to get some good not legal advice, because that might be wrong to do on TV, but we'll get a lot of good political advice from him tonight. And then on his right is a well-known character here at Public Access TV, Bruce Rittenhouse, a candidate for city office, I'm sure. And Bruce is really the guy who's he's the lead lobbyist on this issue. He's been facing down city council, doing impressive presentations to city council. He'll be performing again in front of the ordinance committee, I'm sure. And Bruce is here to tell us some of the hardcore realities of grassroots bare knuckle fighting. So altogether, we've got a hell of a lot of talent here in the studio tonight. And where should we start? Maybe we'll start with Proposition 215, or was it 217? 215. 215, that was passed by initiative of the people of California, right?
In 1996.
Gosh, 4 years ago.
Yes.
And how much good is it doing us?
Well, you know, people were using marijuana for medicinal purposes before Prop 215. They continue to do so after Prop 215. The dilemma they face is where to get marijuana to use medicinally, how to get a safe product, how to get it at a reasonable cost,
Yep.
and how to get it without fear of being arrested.
hassled by the cops.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
That's where we're at. Nothing has been done to implement Proposition 215 since 1996. That's why my friend Bruce Rittenhouse, on his own initiative, has introduced an ordinance, and the Ordinance Committee is now studying it.
Here in Santa Barbara, right?
Yes, correct.
But how's it going statewide? Does anybody really have the right to use medicinal marijuana, even if they grow it for themselves, and don't sell it, don't trade, just grow it and consume it for their medical problems? Do they really have the right, or is it still, unfortunately, a privilege?
I'll tell you what I tell patients who ask that question, is that because the state has not passed the implementing legislation to go along with the initiative that makes it legal, it's basically a free-for-all, that it's up to the individual discretion of every individual police officer in the state of California, and then it's up to the discretion of the assistant district attorney who gets the case, and then it may be up to the discretion of the jury. Now, as a practical matter, there are a number of jurisdictions that have got guidelines and that recognize that the people voted fairly overwhelmingly, 56% of the people statewide, nearly 70% of the people in Santa Barbara, that this is the law in the state of California. The federal government still has a problem with that, and I think some other people are going to address that. They actually had a press conference shortly after the initiative passed where General McCaffrey, he was the fellow that Seymour Hersh recently accused of being a war criminal, and he's our drug czar.
Of more than one war. The Gulf War and the war on drugs.
That's right.
He's got a real record.
And Donna Shalala and Janet Reno, and they threatened doctors that they would bar them from receiving Medicaid payments, Medicare payments, and that they would not give them their BNDD number, which allows you to write triplicate prescriptions, and which some insurance companies use as a provider identifier for payment of insurance payments. The CMA and the AMA both challenged the federal government, and there was a lawsuit called Conant versus McCaffrey. And actually, an associate of mine who was in the Nixon White House was one of the litigants there. The interesting thing here is that the Nixon administration was far more liberal towards marijuana than the Clinton administration. There were 700,000 arrests last year in the Clinton administration. And Nixon's, who had the first drug czar, was a distinguished physician named Dr. Jerome Jaffe, who wrote the chapter in the standard textbook on pharmacology for medical schools. He was a professor in a medical school. He treated opiate abusers. So Jaffe was well-trained, appropriately trained. His focus was on treatment as opposed to McCaffrey, who needs to go back for some remedial education.
I hate to interrupt here, but you just hit on a libertarian theme. We are very familiar with the coercive statist technique of starting some new war and appointing some new czar, and the first one out of the bag is better than the rest of them. It always starts out with good intentions, but it quickly deteriorates into just power grabbing, power lusting, and destroy. So that's an old libertarian thing. Applies to NASA and all kinds of organizations.
What I've told the patients is that, look, if you're not selling the marijuana, if you don't have large amounts, and of course large amounts is subjective, if you're not growing large amounts, that too is subjective, and you have a legitimate medical reason, the likelihood is that even if you're arrested, it won't go to trial, and if it goes to trial, you're not likely to be tried. But that's not what the initiative was about. The opponents of the initiative had it right. The opponents were the California DA's Association, the California Sheriff's Association, the then Attorney General of the state of California, Dan Lundgren. They said that if Prop 215 passes, that it will be legal for the people of the state of California to possess and grow marijuana if a physician recommends it for something that it's good for just about anything.
Yeah, you brought up a key word there, recommends rather than prescribes. You want to touch on that, Seymour? Or?
I was just going to say that. All I was just going to say is that's the whole reason that I stepped up and said it's time to make some sort of implementation possible in the city, because it's so confusing throughout the state, because other jurisdictions have stepped forward and have written ordinances like Santa Cruz and Oakland and Berkeley and San Francisco and Arcadia, and a whole host of cities have stepped forward to do this, and I thought that not being the first is probably a good idea. We can learn from this, and we can craft one and make it the model for the whole state. And yes, it is all about recommendations rather than prescriptions. The only reason I jumped in, it's interesting, at the city council meeting, the law enforcement was put as the lead agency from the city to do the preparation for the city council, and they went out in uniform and asked doctors if they prescribe marijuana. Of course the answer is no.
Well, that's an objective study.
Of course the answer is no. So it opened the door then for us to come in at least and say, well, you know, the staff report's totally wrong. At least be reasonable and take a look at this. So I can tell you more about the federal government and why it really is a state issue and that we're part of the government as much as anybody else.
Well, that really brings up the question of where do we, the people, get into this struggle? Because on the one hand, we see the jackbooted thugs from the federal level ready to do anything to anybody to enforce their war. On the local level, we've got state politicians who are not really leading. They're being pushed by a public initiative to start with, and they're not implementing. And here we are on a local level living within another police state, in my opinion. How the heck do we create a bottom-up grassroots rebellion to tolerate vice in the form of legalized marijuana?
It's working.
Well, it is incrementally.
It started.
How do we do this? How do we organize? How do we...
Well, by doing what you're doing, Bob, and we really appreciate it. You know, Dave Bierman has pointed out to me that medicinal marijuana has been used for like 3 millennia. It's only been since 1937 that the federal government prohibited the use of marijuana. The question is, on what authority did the federal government do this? Federal government can't tell you what you can grow. They have no jurisdiction over agriculture or medicine. As you know, the federal government is limited in what it can do by what we have told them that they can do in the Constitution. Federal government has limited powers. All other powers are retained by the states and the people.
Until President Clinton starts signing every exative order imaginable in the last days of his
I think
what happened is in the only basis for federal jurisdiction is that they don't think that marijuana should be imported from foreign countries or distributed over state lines.
Okay.
That's their jurisdiction.
Well, this is William Wagener on Second Thought again. Did you just notice something that isn't true? Seymour Weisberg made the statement that about the government, the federal government doesn't impinge on agriculture. That's not true. Right here in the Central Coast, we've had the Adams Brothers farms had their lettuce and broccoli records arrested. Since 1998, they now require federal permits if someone finds an endangered species. Do you see how the government has gone from just trying to make everything illegal that might be, you know, mind-altering to making even lettuce and broccoli growing illegal? The government is getting way too big, and apparently Seymour didn't understand this or wasn't aware of the battle that took place when 20 SWAT team officers stormed into the Adams Brothers farm office out on West Main Street in Santa Maria on the Central Coast of California. He wasn't aware of that. But the point I'm bringing across to you is the government is intruding further. They weren't satisfied to ignore the medical marijuana decriminalization in California. They got a new federal law. If they find an endangered species, they can make you get a permit, and without it, it's going to cost you big bucks for attorneys. Big bucks. Let's go back now, and I want you to re-listen as he says agriculture. It's not true. The government is way out of control. Pay close attention to what Seymour says just now.
Medicinal marijuana has been used for like 3 millennia. It's only been since 1937 that the federal government prohibited the use of marijuana. The question is, on what authority did the federal government do this? Federal government can't tell you what you can grow. They have no jurisdiction over agriculture or medicine. As you know, the federal government is limited in what it can do by what we have told them that they can do in the Constitution. Federal government has limited powers. All other powers are retained by the states and the people.
Until President Clinton starts signing every executive order imaginable in the last days of his legacy.
What happened is in the only basis for federal jurisdiction is that they don't think that marijuana should be imported from foreign countries or distributed over state lines.
Okay.
That's their jurisdiction over interstate and foreign commerce.
So how does that end up saying we can't even grow it at home?
That's the question. I mean, we're proposing here through the Compassionate Cannabis Center in Santa Barbara to distribute marijuana to those patients who are seriously ill and need it to alleviate their medical conditions. And we're not impacting foreign commerce or interstate commerce because we're growing it and distributing it here to patients who are in need pursuant to state law adopted by the people of the state of California.
Absolutely.
And where does the federal government get off threatening the doctors of the state of California and the people of the state of California for doing what they have an inalienable right to do?
I'm glad you're making this argument, because conservatives out there are largely indifferent to our plight and our cause, and conservatives need to realize that the government today, the federal government, is so out of control that when they decide to wage a war on drugs, they don't even have to do what the old boys did to outlaw alcohol and get a constitutional amendment allowing prohibition. Our government today just writes an executive order and wages war, drops bombs on Kosovo. To hell with the people.
You know, let me say a good word for the conservatives. And by the way, I'm a registered Democrat. I'm not a conservative. Although I think that to label people is wrong. On some issues I'm conservative, some I'm liberal, some I'm middle of the road. People who are bona fide conservatives, as opposed to the people who want to use the federal government's powers in a way to have an agenda that's different than the liberal agenda, really share the same feelings about cannabis. Let's take a look at some. Senator Barry Goldwater supported the Arizona initiative for medicinal marijuana. William F. Buckley has been an outspoken proponent of the legalization of marijuana. Forget the medicinal part of it. Milton Friedman, the conservative economist, has said that this is folly from an economic point of view. Nixon's Secretary of State, George Shultz, favors the legalization of marijuana. Lynn Nofzinger, who was the campaign guru for Nixon, is a strong proponent of medicinal marijuana. The Nixon Marijuana Commission, which he appointed and then said, don't come back and tell me to legalize marijuana, under the leadership of moderate Republican Governor Schaefer of Pennsylvania, came back and told him, legalize marijuana. You've got Governor Johnson of New Mexico, who's a two-term Republican governor, that has said this whole approach is absurd. The Cato Institute, which is a conservative think tank, has long been a proponent of the legalization of marijuana. And you have more and more physicians, not known for political liberalism, who are saying, you know, this does have medicinal value. So I think that if conservatives will take a look at what their political leaders are saying, that they'll recognize that this is an issue that they should sign on to. In California, interestingly, you have Senator Feinstein, who purports to be a Democrat, who actually, in her law trying to limit the manufacture of methamphetamine, wants to prevent discussion of Schedule I drugs. Could make this particular show illegal, what we're talking about here, if this was passed in law, until, of course, the Supreme Court struck it down. It would have a chilling effect, though, while it was working. On the other hand, her conservative opponent, Republican senatorial candidate Campbell, is in favor of the legalization of marijuana. So it's good to see that these issues
across the board.
This transcends politics. If you're a liberal and you believe in tolerance and compassion for those who are in need and can derive medical benefit from this, you've got to be in favor of it. If you're a conservative And you're concerned about the money we're wasting on this war on drugs, which we're losing day after day. And you're thinking about, in hard terms, of how can we get the most for our buck in terms of improving public health. And you're concerned about the expansion of federal power and in the invasion into our local affairs, into our homes and our private lives. Then you're on our side. You're for the decriminalization of marijuana.
If you're
Watching On Second Thought as we replay the libertarian alternative from the host there, Robert Backus in Santa Barbara. Did you just notice what was listed off? William F. Buckley, a well-known conservative Republican, favors decriminalization of marijuana, and not just medical marijuana, but just decriminalize marijuana, period. And he's a conservative. You don't get much more conservative than William F. Buckley. He's the guy that got Ronald Reagan to switch from liberal Democrat to Republican. There's a whole list. So you see, this goes beyond party label. But there's only one party that has for years and years stood alone saying decriminalize marijuana, decriminalize some of these other drugs. Only the Libertarian Party has said that consistently, and all their candidates stand behind that concept. Because it isn't a matter of trying to get people to drink more beer or whiskey or smoke marijuana, do drugs. The real issue is, what are the benefits and what are the negatives? And the benefits, even the Dr. Bierman recognized, are there for medical marijuana and for marijuana, period. This Robert Backus you're watching, I may point out, is the same Robert Backus who once ran for Congress as a libertarian, and he's also the same Robert Backus that took Santa Barbara County Sheriff Jim Thomas to court for misuse of government property during a election, right before the election, when he was pushing, Sheriff Thomas was pushing for a new jail facility and a huge bond measure. So this Robert Backus is a very intelligent person, and he's brought together two marijuana users, a lawyer and a doctor, and we're going to continue now. I just wanted you to take notice that this isn't just a libertarian issue. We're going to continue now as we roll on with the discussion that took place in July of the year 2000. Thanks for watching On Second Thought.
with the searches and seizures.
Who hasn't been touched by AIDS or cancer or someone suffering or someone dying in their family, and you sit there trying to figure out, what can I do? And then we come up with something that we can do something with. You were at the meeting at the city council. Not one voice was spoken against it.
Yeah.
Those people weren't organized to come down. When you ask what people can do, that's what you can do. Let those 4 people who were brave enough to cast those political votes at the council meeting know that you support them, and you support it. And the 3 who, because it was a law enforcement issue and because politically they couldn't vote against the police department, let those 3 people know how unhappy you are.
Right.
Every citizen can do that.
I would like to say that it really disturbs me to see people like the general and the police department practicing medicine. I wonder, now, see, I'm not a libertarian, so I don't think you should practice medicine without a license. I really think the state...
Very good move.
I think the state should regulate these sorts of things, and that we shouldn't make sure that there aren't quacks and charlatans out there. One thing I'd like to say is that people out there may be saying, well, wait a minute, marijuana, that's terrible stuff. And I think we have to recognize that there has been an almost 80-year propaganda campaign. And the first thing that happened was that William Randolph Hearst started calling cannabis marijuana. Cannabis was introduced into American medicine in 1839. It had been in Chinese medicine since about 1643 BC, at least 1643 BC. And it was commonly found in patent medicines that could be purchased at the corner grocery store, the corner drugstore, from the 1870s until the 1920s. So the American public was very familiar with cannabis. And nobody had any motivational syndrome, nobody went crazy, nobody murdered people, nobody went on to heroin. But Hearst had an anti-Hispanic and that helped fan the flames of the Spanish-American War. And then in the second decade of this century, I still think we're in the 20th century, by the way, he had an anti-Mexican immigrant stance. And he used the word marijuana to demonize not only the drug, but even more so the Mexican immigrants. And the first laws in this country were passed in Western states that had Mexican immigrant workers. And they've been all over the map in terms of the allegations of what marijuana, what cannabis does. And the fact of the matter is that we have over 4,000 years of history that prove that these things are wrong. The only group that testified against the Marijuana Tax Act in 1937 was the American Medical Association. The American Medical Association. And by the way, in terms of having a lead agency, I was talking a couple of months ago with Dr. George Flores. He used to be the Assistant Health Officer for Santa Barbara County, and then was a Health Officer for Sonoma County, and now is a Health Officer for San Diego County. And in Sonoma County, the County Health Department is a lead agency. And I've talked to Dr. Elliot Schulman, who's the Health Officer for this county, and he indicated to me that when our medical review committee comes up with guidelines, that he'll be happy to look at them and comment on them. You know, he's an elected official. He works for the county. I mean, he didn't say, I'm all behind this and all this sort of thing, but he was extremely professional about it, and he certainly knows Dr. Flores. And clearly, we need to stop treating people with illnesses by throwing them in jail. And if the police want to practice medicine, I say let's give them training. You know?
Let me throw one more thing in for the conservatives, because right now we're coming up on the 55th anniversary of the United Nations, and conservatives generally are a little bit hostile to the United Nations since it's so hostile to America. And the 55th anniversary of the United Nations is getting ready to really gear up for police state globalization. They are proposing a multi-trillion-dollar tax to subsidize the United Nations, a standing army for the United Nations. And guess what their lead issue is? To expand the war on drugs, to make it an international global war. And so if you want to be a part of that, if you want to surrender American sovereignty, and Bill Clinton looks like he's ready, you know, just to sign it away anytime, then go ahead, conservatives. Join in with the war on drugs. It's going to be a global war, and the United Nations is going to be happy to come into your home and quarter troops there and take away your guns and just, you know, implement their war on drugs on you. So I think conservatives need to wake up on this issue, that it's time. Destabilization of nations and the whole world is at stake here. So conservatives don't just poo-poo it, even though it's right here in our backyard. Doctor, you know, I want to get something from you about this Marinol phenomena. You've mentioned that the government has this hostility towards smoking weed, pot, and yet they don't seem to have such great hostility to the actual purification processing of the THC element, Marinol, that's in it.
Yeah, that's kind of a contradiction, isn't it?
Yeah.
Marinol is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. It's considered to be the most pharmacologically active, chemical principle in marijuana, or cannabis as I like to call it. Actually, there are over 360 chemicals in cannabis, 60 of which
secret ingredients.
Yeah.
Natural ingredients.
Yes.
And there's a very interesting physician in England who's been lauded by the House of Lords and is engaged in some interesting experiments using extract from the whole cannabis plant, who has talked about a balance between tetrahydrocannabinol and cannabidiols, which are also in marijuana. A lot of people feel that Marinol, they get too high on Marinol. It's interesting that here you have the government is concerned about people getting high on marijuana, and yet particularly naive patients, you know, people who are using Marinol to treat the side effects of cancer chemotherapy, people who've never smoked marijuana, prefer marijuana over Marinol because they're much more able to control the dose, and they don't have the altered state of consciousness that they get with Marinol. And of course, Marinol, a month's supply of Marinol costs you about $700. So if you don't have insurance, you're not likely to be able to afford Marinol. Also, there's only THC in there, so you're not getting, if it is a combination of the THC and the cannabidiols, you're not getting that. Other people have talked about the fact that smoking it may stimulate certain enzymes in the liver so that you create certain pharmacologically active metabolic intermediaries. I don't want to dominate this, and David is really the person who has provided the engine for this, and I think, I don't want to take over your show, but I think that having him talk about the benefit that people get is really going to put a human face on this.
The bottom line is, I think people know the benefits. I don't even know why we're arguing or trying to get this point across. It's the law. It's been passed into law. Doctors can recommend it. It shouldn't even be an issue. We shouldn't even be sitting here discussing this, number one. We have a center called the Compassionate Cannabis Center here in Santa Barbara that provides cannabis to patients who have doctors' recommendations. We've been doing this. We're doing it now. The last show that we had on here, we were flooded with telephone calls from people who wanted to know what they could do, how they could do this, because they're using it, but they don't have a doctor's recommendation. So they don't know what to do. They don't want to break the law, but yet maybe they're on disability. A lot of people that call me are on disability. They don't have the money to go to a private doctor and get a recommendation, although they could if they had the money. So we need to figure out how we can make this affordable, available, and safe to everybody who needs it. And that's what the Compassionate Cannabis Center is doing here in Santa Barbara, and that's what we want to do. We want to work with the police department. We want to make their job easier. We want to stop them from arresting people and taking their medicine away. In other words, if they find a batch of medicine in somebody's backyard, rather than pull it up and confiscate it, take it away, take that person away, they would call us and say, look, is this person legal? They have a card here that says they belong to this. We verify it. They don't go pull up their plants. Their plants are saved. They're not arrested. They don't have to go through the court system. They don't have to pay bondsmen. They don't have to have this on their record. They don't have to go through all the humiliation of having to deal with this. Somebody that takes a medicine like Valium, they don't have to go through this. Why do people that take this medicine that is so safe and so easy to obtain, why can't we do this?
Absolutely. I think you're absolutely on target there. Folks, you've been listening to these gentlemen speak. You have a good idea now of what they're all about and where they're coming from. We want you to call in and join us. We're interested in hearing from the public and hearing your questions, and we'll try to be as focused and productive in our answers as you are in your questions, so try to stay on topic. The number will be on the screen in a few seconds. I believe it's 564-4153. So don't hesitate to give us a call. Gentlemen, this is certainly a broad topic. We could...
If I could pick up on a point that Dr. Bierman made, you asked about Marinol. He made the point that Marinol is much more psychoactive than...
Yeah, I'm thinking about changing over.
Marijuana. and yet we just learned that the federal government, although it schedules marijuana as a Schedule I drug, which means it has no medicinal use whatsoever, despite millennia of evidence to the contrary, they've reduced Marinol from a Schedule II drug to a Schedule III drug. Dr. Bierman can tell you what that means, but it demonstrates the absurdity of their position in continuing to prohibit marijuana and allowing the pharmaceutical companies to derive increased profits from the more readily available prescription of Marinol.
Let me expand on that. The Schedule I drugs are drugs that presumably they have the statement is that they have no known medical use in the United States. This doesn't mean they don't have any known medical use. It means that the United States doesn't recognize it. Heroin, for instance, is a Schedule I drug, but it's freely prescribed in England. It's an excellent drug to use in people that you've done abdominal surgery on, because not only does it kill pain, but you're only 1/3 as likely to throw up as you are with morphine, and you don't want people vomiting who've had sutures in their abdomen. Marijuana is used to this day as a medicinal in India. It's freely dispensed and used there. So, and we know that it has thousands of years of medicinal use. The Food and Drug Administration schedules these drugs. By the way, a Schedule II drug requires a triplicate form. So it has a kind of a chilling effect on writing a prescription. The physician keeps a copy goes to the federal government, a copy goes to the pharmacist. So that's a fairly tightly regulated drug that's Schedule II. Marinol's gone from Schedule II to Schedule III. The Food and Drug Administration does the scheduling. There have been numerous efforts to try to reschedule marijuana from a Schedule I to another category. An administrative law judge who heard several years of testimony, named Francis Young, in 1988 said marijuana is one of, if not the safest medicinal known to mankind. His recommendation was to reschedule it. He was overruled by higher the government.
I find interesting that one of the questions all the politicians ask is, well, why hasn't it been tested more thoroughly? And of course, it's the government that prevents the testing from taking place. We heard that asked at a council meeting.
That's the same thing as the council doing a study by sending policemen to
absolutely outrageous that they want more studies. And as you indicated, the doctors are obligated in triplicate to do those Schedule IIs. Physicians have called and talked with me actually since this council meeting, and they're scared to death to even recommend it because they think somewhere along the line their name's going in a computer. Yeah, they're going to be listed to their government. Okay. And so
well, let me tell you something absurd that I heard. I went to a conference that was put on by UCSF and endorsed by the California Medical Association on cannabis therapeutics. And one of the co-sponsors or co-chairs of this was an attorney who had been an attorney with the CMA for 11 years. She's no longer with them. But she said, yes, doctors, you can recommend and approve, no problem. You just can't tell your patients where to get it. Because that puts you in violation of federal law, and you become potentially guilty of aiding and abetting in the procurement of an illegal substance. That's by right. Telling people the Santa Barbara Cannabis Club can be found at blah, blah, blah. Right. That, if a doctor does that, then they are in violation of federal law.
They've criminalized gardening, they've criminalized shopping.
And they've criminalized speaking.
Our lines are all lit up. Let's go to Frank on line 2. Frank, are you there?
Yes, I find this an excellent subject. I'd like to comment. A good friend of mine, and I'm also a Vietnam vet, a friend of mine was hit in the chest. He was the first air cav in Vietnam during the Tet Offensive. He was hit in the chest, and he went to the field hospital, and the surgeon looked at him and said he noticed that he had marijuana on him at the time, and when he's taking off his fatigue jacket, and he said to him, he says, well, it's a good thing you were stoned, because if you would see this hole in your chest, you probably would have gone into shock and died. And that was the first time it ever came to me that maybe something like this would be beneficial for people in a medical setting. I myself went through the 60s. I went through the whole drug culture, and I have my pros and cons about it, but I do think that if this substance has something medical beneficial, I think it's high time it should be used. I'll get off the line.
Thank you, Frank. Yeah, it's obvious that marijuana is an effective anesthesia of sorts. But it goes a lot further than that. Let's go to Doug on line 1. Doug?
Yes, hi.
I'm William Wagener on Second Thought here on the Central Coast of California. I'm glad you stuck with us. This is a really important discussion. Deals with the basic issues of liberty and who owns your body. Do you own it or does the government own it? The libertarian position, as long as you don't hurt someone else, you should be free to live your life the way you choose to live it, not the way some government drug czar or some anti-drug person in the state capitol thinks. You just heard one of the call-in viewers there in Santa Barbara talk about the fact that in Vietnam, marijuana relieved pain. I'm a Vietnam veteran, and I can verify that also. On one flight from Pleiku in the Central Highlands of Vietnam down to Phuket Air Base on an emergency run there were several people on the same chopper that were badly injured, and they were being rushed down to Phuket. I don't know why Phuket and not the other hospital, but I remember clearly in mid-flight, one of them was in so much pain, he kept saying, I'm going to die, I'm going to die. And the officer, the Army officer, and the medical corps man that were trying to keep him alive whipped out a marijuana cigarette, lit it up, and stuck it in his mouth, and he calmed down. Later, after he'd gotten off the chopper, they carried him off the chopper, I was a little blown away because I'm not a marijuana user. I wasn't shocked because I'd seen lots of GIs in Vietnam use marijuana. But I asked the officer something to the effect, I don't remember the exact words, I asked him, is that a medicine? And he said, it's the best and cheapest medicine we have in Vietnam. People just don't know it except the guys that use it. And I was blown away because this was a medical doctor and a corpsman. So that is not a way out story. And that was quite common. Men who were badly injured, if someone had marijuana, they would light it up, stick it in their mouth, and calm them down because it took away the pain, took the edge off the pain, and allowed their brain to function in a way that they didn't expire from pumping out too much blood through their wounds. So I just wanted to share that little bit with you. I'm William Wagener. This is On Second Thought. You can email me at bjwagener@hotmail.com. If you have any comments, I'll be glad to read your emails later on. Go ahead and email me at bjwagener@hotmail.com. And we're going back to this discussion now, a really valuable discussion with Dr. Bierman and attorney Seymour Weisberg with the host, Robert Backus, a very intelligent libertarian from Santa Barbara.
Come on, Doug.
Yes, hi. I just had a sort of a, I'm going to just give my position, and I think it's, tell me if you think it's aligned with a libertarian point of view. But I don't see anything per se wrong with taking anything that you want to take in your own body. However, I do think that if you get stoned or any other kind of thing, intoxicated like you would with alcohol or anything else, and it causes you to do something that harms somebody else, you should be held fully liable for your acts, including murder. I saw some of these Channel 57 shows lately on murder, and part of their defense was that the guy was stoned, and therefore he lacked proper mens rea to be held as first-degree murder liable. When we have a legal system set up like this, where because you are in some intoxicated state, it forgives your acts and takes away your intent, I think that's what really gets most citizens a little bit dithering a little bit about whether they want to have that released on the society. If people are not held accountable, it's like driving a car 90 miles an hour, taking off the steering wheel, and then saying, well, I didn't do it, I wasn't responsible because I took the steering wheel off.
Okay, Doug, you asked if that's a libertarian position you're stating, and to a large degree it is. We definitely believe that what people do in the privacy of their own home and lives, as long as they're not affecting anybody else, that's totally and absolutely their business. If they want to snort cyanide like it used to be fashionable to do, they can do so. But if they want to commit suicide, that's fine. But they should not operate vehicles, they should not drive under the influence, they should not do anything that harms others or threatens to harm others. And if they do, they should be held as strictly accountable as the law can allow. Now, your debate about whether it's first-degree murder or second-degree manslaughter, that's a judicial debate that we as libertarians really don't enter into very fully because it's a very complex thing. And it really doesn't bear on tonight's discussion other than you're right. some people frustrated with the court system will kick back their frustration on, well, let's pound on everybody because I don't feel good.
Could I talk a little bit about the pharmacology here? Because I think Doug has kind of led us astray, and I want to pull us back. First off, there was an interesting study that was done in Australia that said, let's take a look at automobile accidents, and let's call the accident rate of people that are drug-free as 1. What they found is that people that had been drinking had an accident rate that was 6.8 times people that were drug-free. People who had smoked marijuana had an accident rate that was 0.6. That is almost half of that of people who were drug-free. Now, I'm not saying if you smoke marijuana and you'll drive safely, and I'm not even saying drive while you're smoking. But what I'm saying is that as a pharmacological agent, the things of that, well, it has, changes your psychomotor perceptions and so forth. The effects are not nearly as dramatic as other drugs. I go back to the administrative law judge for the FDA who talked about how safe cannabis was. The other thing is, if we're taking a look at drugs and violence, we know what drug is associated the most with violence. That drug is alcohol. There are 150,000 deaths a year due to alcohol. There are 425,000 deaths a year due to tobacco. This is the National Institute of Drug Abuse that has these numbers. There are 0 deaths a year due to cannabis. Cannabis...
well, there are deaths now due to the lack of cannabis.
Well, actually, cannabis is more of a symptom reliever and palliation. Well,
so you're saying there could be alternatives in the medicinal?
No, what I'm saying is that many of these conditions are not cured by cannabis, although multiple sclerosis may be slowed down or stopped by cannabis. So you may be right. You may be right.
But whether it's cannabis or alcohol or any other substance, it does not excuse criminal conduct and never has. But the jury is entitled to consider whether the person they're judging is a cold-blooded killer or an intoxicated person, and the jury may make a distinction based upon that as to the degree of the offense. That's all we're talking about.
There was an excellent letter in the Independent just recently, or maybe it was the News Press, that had the discussion about the date rape drug and how a particular drug has been singled out as a date rape drug and been demonized as this is the favorite use drug of choice for those who want to rape their date. And this letter wrote in and said, quit the demonization. The date rape drug of choice has always been, always will be alcohol.
Well, they were putting it in the young lady's drink, and I'm not making excuses for it, but the allegation was she was mixing Red Bull and tequila and thinks somebody put something in her drink. And then we pass out cards that say party smart. Why don't we say use your drugs smart?
Yep.
Somebody was putting drugs in her drugs is what they were doing.
Yeah, is what they were doing. Yeah. And it's a good point, Bob. That was an excellent letter. That's another way, by the way, that people can affect us. Letters to the editor do make a difference. If you're out there and you believe in what we're talking about,
myself
pick up and it makes a difference. People read your letters, and it also helps influence the media. They read the letters.
And getting back to the medicinal thing, if I tell people if they're going to use Marinol, if they're going to use cannabis, you should not operate heavy equipment. This can impair your functioning. Actually, in the studies that have been done in regards to operating automobiles and operating airplanes, what they found is that there is no impact on the normal performance of an automobile or normal performance of flying an airplane, but there is some impairment if you're faced with an emergency situation. Say like on a simulator with an airplane, if a helicopter suddenly appeared, people don't perform as well that have smoked marijuana as people who are drug-free. So I'm not saying that it doesn't have some impacts on people, but what I am saying is that we've been so sensitized by propaganda that we place a whole different standard on cannabis than we do on other medicinals.
David ought to talk a little about the impact. What is the impact, David? I mean, does it prevent you from driving when you medicate? Does it prevent you from walking down the street? Can you read a book?
Well, I work 12 hours a day. I drive a vehicle 12 hours a day. I have not had an accident in 2 years. I have not gone a day without smoking cannabis in 2 years. I have not gone a day without smoking cannabis probably at least every 2 hours for the last 2 years. I haven't had an accident in 2 years. Did I already say that?
Yeah. It bears repeating.
My job performance, I'm probably so dedicated, it does not affect you in any, me personally, a 14-year-old kid smokes a joint, I don't know how it's going to affect him.
Right.
Don't want him smoking it. But
when
me
you
as a medical patient, I could not live without it. It would be life-threatening to me to do without it. Even if it's psychological to me, it's still worth it. And let me say, going back to the Marinol and taking that and everything, we've got new systems of delivery now that you don't have to inhale the smoke. So
Clinton will be happy to hear
get
about
off
that.
of it. Let's get away from the smoke thing, because you don't have to smoke cannabis. You can put it in your food. You can take a bud and put it in alcohol and let it soak. There's many ways to ingest cannabis besides inhaling the smoke.
And you can regulate it, right?
And
That's
you can
what makes the
regulate
difference.
You can regulate it. I use a vaporizer as often as I can, because the vaporizer does not give me the carcinogens. All it does is release the essential oils and the vapors of the cannabis that I need. There's no odor to it. It doesn't stink. It doesn't smell. It doesn't bother my neighbors. You know, you worry about. I actually worry about things like that. I don't want to offend my neighbors. I don't want them. It smells bad. But then again, we can take the smell out of it.
Yep.
If you want to take the stink out of it.